We live in an age where information is infinite and wisdom is vanishing. Carl Sagan once said that we live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. It's a warning that feels even more urgent today, because in the digital age, we are surrounded by endless knowledge, yet we rarely think deeply. We scroll, we skim, we consume, and we mistake this consumption for understanding. The internet gives us the feeling of being informed, even when we are quietly becoming more confused, more errative, and more intellectually fragile. Tonight, we are going to explore why a world overflowing with information can still leave us ignorant. Why access to knowledge does not equal wisdom. Why the illusion of knowing is more dangerous than not knowing at all. And how, in this age of infinite answers, we can learn to ask real questions again. We are living in a moment that no philosopher, no scientist, no ancient teacher could have imagined, a moment in which all of human knowledge, from the most profound discoveries to the most trivial curiosities, exists at the edge of our fingertips. A moment in which answers arrive faster than questions can even form. A moment in which the world, once vast and mysterious, has collapsed into a glowing rectangle that fits in our palm. This is the age of infinite information, and it is changing the human mind in ways we are only beginning to understand. For most of human history, information was rare. To learn something required effort. Reading, observing, questioning, studying, traveling, listening. Knowledge was a reward earned through time and patience. It lived in conversations, in books, in libraries, in the hands of teachers who passed understanding from one mind to another. But now, knowledge is everywhere. And because it is everywhere, we experience it differently. The internet has turned information into a constant atmosphere, a sort of intellectual weather that surrounds us. Every moment of the day, we breathe it in without noticing. We absorb fragments, headlines, opinions, summaries, memes, arguments, explanations. Each one tiny, light, easy to grasp, easy to forget. And in this flood, something unexpected happens. The more information we encounter, the less we feel the need to understand it. This is the illusion of knowledge, because when facts are easy to access, thinking becomes easy to avoid. Why wrestle with a concept when you can skim a summary? Why read an entire article when the headline already tells you how to feel? Why learn a subject deeply when a 30-second video promises everything you need to know? The mind, overwhelmed by abundance, begins to confuse exposure with understanding. Simply seeing information, even for a moment, gives us the comforting illusion that we know something about it. We scroll past a topic and feel informed. We watch a short clip and feel educated. We read a thread and feel enlightened. But exposure is not comprehension. Familiarity is not mastery. Knowing of something is not the same as knowing about it. And yet the brain does not distinguish these states. It experiences the feeling of recognition as a form of knowledge. It interprets the ease of access as the ease of understanding. It mistakes the availability of information for the possession of wisdom. The internet also changes the rhythm of thought, where information once arrived slowly, giving the mind space to process, reflect, and integrate. It now arrives as an unbroken stream, fast, fragmented, relentless. The mind never finishes one thought before another pulls it away. Ideas do not mature. This constant stimulation creates a strange paradox. The more we know, the less we think. Because thinking requires friction, gaps, pauses, uncertainty, time. Thinking requires a slow unfolding of ideas, the patient layering of one insight upon another. Thinking requires depth, not speed. But the internet rewards speed. It rewards immediacy. It rewards reaction. In this environment, the mind shifts from being a vessel of understanding to being a conveyor belt of impressions. Ideas pass through quickly, without anchoring, without merging, without transforming into anything deeper. And as this process repeats day after day, the ability to think deeply begins to weaken, not because we lack intelligence, but because we lack the conditions that allow intelligence to function. Another quiet consequence of infinite information is the erosion of intellectual humility. When the world's knowledge is a click away, it becomes difficult to distinguish between genuine understanding and the temporary sense of competence that comes from quick access. People begin to feel smarter than they are. They begin to believe they have mastered subjects they have merely glanced at. They underestimate the complexity of the world because the internet presents everything in simplified snippet. This illusion of competence can be dangerous. It produces confidence without comprehension, opinions without investigation, certainty without depth, and certainty, when unearned, becomes a barrier to learning, a closed door where an open mind should be. But perhaps the most profound effect of infinite information is this: we no longer protect our attention. In a world where information is abundant, attention becomes the scarce resource. What we choose to focus on determines the shape of our inner world. Yet most of us give our attention away freely, allowing it to be pulled, fragmented, manipulated by forces we barely notice. Without conscious attention, thinking becomes shallow, and in a shallow intellectual environment, the illusion of knowledge thrives. This is the paradox of our age. We have more access to knowledge than ever before, yet many of us understand less. We can answer any question instantly, yet rarely ask the deeper questions. We feel informed, yet quietly drift through a fog of unexamined assumptions. But this paradox is not destiny. It is an invitation to slow down, to question, to reclaim the space where true understanding grows. Because in the age of infinite information, wisdom belongs not to those who know more, but to those who learn to think again. Why the mind chooses ease over understanding. One of the most overlooked truths about the human mind is that it is not designed to seek truth. It is designed to conserve energy. For most of human history, this biological efficiency was a survival advantage. The brain learned to recognize patterns quickly, to make snap judgments, to rely on intuition, to form habits that allowed life to unfold with as little cognitive effort as possible. Thinking deeply was reserved for moments when it was absolutely necessary. But in the digital age, where information flows endlessly and effortlessly, this ancient tendency has collided with a new technological reality. And the result is a mind that increasingly substitutes shortcuts for understanding. Cognitive shortcuts, or heuristics, are mental pathways the brain uses to avoid effort. They work beautifully when information is scarce. But when information becomes excessive and overwhelming, these shortcuts begin to distort our perception of knowledge itself. The internet presents the mind with more information than it can possibly process, and so the brain adapts by simplifying everything. Skim instead of read, react instead of analyze, assume instead of investigate, remember headlines instead of reasoning. This is not a sign of stupidity, it is the brain's attempt to survive an environment it was never built for. The first shortcut the mind takes is the illusion of comprehension. When information is presented in small, digestible pieces, the brain interprets this ease as understanding. A short explanation feels complete. A summary feels sufficient. A meme feels like a worldview. A single statistic feels like evidence. The brain mistakes the fluidity of reading for the depth of knowing. There is a psychological phenomenon behind this. The easier information is to process, the truer it feels. This is called processing fluency. When something is simple, the mind relaxes, confidence grows, and skepticism fades. When something is complex, the mind tenses, slows down, doubts itself, and often rejects the information entirely. In a world where knowledge is simplified for convenience, ease becomes a substitute for accuracy. Another cognitive shortcut intensified by the internet is confirmation bias. The tendency to accept information that aligns with our existing beliefs and dismiss what contradicts them. This shortcut was once a manageable flaw in human reasoning. Now, amplified by algorithms that feed us only what we want to see, it becomes a self-reinforcing loop. The mind takes the easiest path. Believe what feels familiar, trust what feels comfortable, dismiss what feels challenging. This protects the ego but damages the intellect. The brain also relies heavily on availability bias. The tendency to believe something is common or true simply because we see it often. The internet turns this bias into a psychological trap. Repetition feels like evidence. Virality feels like importance. Visibility feels like truth. When a false idea appears everywhere, the brain mistakes saturation for accuracy. Then there is the Dunning-Kruger effect, a cognitive shortcut in which people overestimate their understanding because they know so little that they cannot see the gaps. The internet intensifies this by giving everyone equal access to surface-level information. It is easy to feel like an expert when expertise is measured by familiarity instead of mastery. This shortcut is especially dangerous because it produces confidence without comprehension, the most stubborn form of ignorance. But perhaps the most subtle cognitive shortcut is cognitive offloading, the tendency to let external devices hold information for us. We no longer remember facts because we can search them. We no longer analyze because we can rely on someone else's explanation. We no longer hold ideas in our minds long enough for them to transform into insights. The brain begins to treat the internet as an extension of itself, a convenient but fragile form of outsourced memory. But outsourced memory weakens internal reasoning. When the brain stops storing information, it stops connecting information. And without connection, true understanding cannot form. All these shortcuts point to a single profound truth. The more accessible information becomes, the less motivated the mind is to engage with it deeply. Understanding requires effort, and effort feels unnecessary in a world where answers are immediate. Why struggle when the answer is one tap away? Why think when someone else already has? But this ease comes with a price. When the mind relies too heavily on shortcuts, thinking begins to shrink. Curiosity fades. Skepticism weakens. Insight becomes rare. The mind becomes reactive rather than reflective. Cognitive shortcuts are not the enemy. They're natural, ancient, efficient, but they become dangerous when the world demands depth and the mind responds with speed. When the world demands understanding and the mind responds with familiarity. Yet the beauty in all of this is that the mind can be retrained. Shortcuts can be interrupted. The desire for ease can be balanced by the desire for truth. The brain, remarkable as it is, can learn to pause, to question, to move beyond the first interpretation and into the deeper layers where real knowledge begins. Because the goal is not to eliminate shortcuts, but to recognize them, and in that recognition, to reclaim the choice to think again. How effort became the enemy of understanding. There was once a time when learning something new required a kind of intellectual pilgrimage, a journey through uncertainty, confusion, questions, and long stretches of effort that shaped the mind as much as the knowledge itself. Books were read slowly, ideas were wrestled with. Skills were built through repetition and patience. Understanding was something earned, not downloaded. Difficulty, once seen as a necessary part of growth, is now treated as an obstacle, something to be eliminated, bypassed, or avoided entirely. The internet, with its endless shortcuts, has created a culture in which ease is equated with intelligence, and discomfort is mistaken for failure. When effort disappears, understanding disappears with it. The death of difficulty began innocently with good intentions. Search engines were designed to help us find information faster. Tutorials were created to simplify complex tasks. Platforms emerged to compress knowledge into smaller, more digestible pieces. But slowly, subtly, the mind adapted to this new environment. We began to expect learning to feel effortless. We began to expect answers to arrive instantly. We began to lose touch with the slow, sometimes frustrating process that strengthens the muscles of thought. The human brain develops depth through struggle, not suffering, but cognitive challenge. Difficulty forces us to slow down, to test our assumptions, to integrate ideas, instead of merely recognizing them. It teaches patience, resilience, and insight. It strengthens neural pathways responsible for reasoning, concentration, and memory. When difficulty disappears, these pathways weaken. This weakening shows itself in countless small ways. The inability to read long texts without drifting, the impulse to skip explanations and jump to conclusions, the frustration that arises when a concept doesn't click instantly, the instinct to abandon a task when it feels mentally taxing. The modern mind is not failing. It is simply untrained for genuine effort. We have grown accustomed to a world where problems are solved with a swipe, where questions are answered by autocomplete, where attention collapses under the weight of constant stimulation. And so, when we encounter intellectual friction, the mind recoils, interpreting effort as inefficiency. But effort is not inefficiency. Effort is engagement. One of the reasons difficulty has died is the rise of instant explanations. Instead of thinking through a question ourselves, we turn immediately to external sources. We rely on summaries instead of full arguments, how-to videos instead of hands-on experimentation, comment sections instead of personal reflection. Each shortcut saves time, but each shortcut also deprives the mind of the slow struggle that transforms information into understanding. Another reason difficulty has faded is the cultural shift toward entertainment-based learning. Today, knowledge is packaged like content, fast, colorful, stimulating. Videos jump from idea to idea, designed to hold attention rather than build depth. Complex topics are delivered in 7-second clips that offer the illusion of clarity while quietly stripping away nuance. When learning becomes entertainment, effort feels outdated. The internet has also conditioned us to expect productivity without boredom. But boredom, the empty space in which the mind wanders, questions, forms connections, is essential for deep thought. Without it, the brain becomes dependent on constant input, unable to sit with a problem long enough for real insight to form. Difficulty dies when attention dies, but perhaps the most dangerous consequence of avoiding difficulty is the erosion of intellectual humility. When everything feels easy, the mind begins to assume that it understands things it has barely encountered. Ease inflates confidence. Difficulty stabilizes it. True understanding often begins with the uncomfortable realization of how much we do not know. But when difficulty is removed, we no longer encounter the friction that reveals the limits of our knowledge. We glide across the surface of ideas without ever feeling the resistance that forces us to dive deeper. And yet, beneath all of this, there is a quiet hope. The mind remembers. It remembers how to focus. It remembers how to wrestle with ideas. It remembers how to persist through confusion. It remembers the satisfaction of clarity that comes not from instant answers, but from hard-earned insight. Difficulty is not something to fear. It is something to reclaim. It is the doorway through which understanding enters. It is the arena where thinking grows strong. It is the whisper that says, "Stay a little longer. Don't settle for the easy version. Let the idea unfold at its own pace." In a world that has forgotten the value of intellectual struggle, choosing difficulty becomes a quiet act of rebellion, a way to honor the depth our minds are still capable of reaching. And when we allow ourselves to meet that difficulty with patience, something extraordinary happens. Knowledge stops feeling like an illusion and begins to feel like truth. Why we mistake exposure for insight. There is a quiet shift happening in the way we interact with information. A shift so subtle that most people barely notice it, even though it shapes every corner of modern thought. It is the transition from reading to skimming, from understanding to recognizing, from engagement with ideas to glancing at them as they rush past in an endless stream of stimulation. Skimming has become the default mode of consuming information, not because we are incapable of reading deeply, but because the architecture of the digital world rewards speed, quantity, and immediacy. The mind adapts to the environment it inhabits, and in an environment of constant scrolling, it learns to move quickly, lightly, without sinking into the substance beneath the surface. Understanding requires stillness. Skimming thrives in motion. Everywhere, information is formatted for skimming. Short paragraphs, bullet points, bold headlines, tiny fragments, designed to deliver a quick jolt of clarity without asking for cognitive effort. This design is not accidental. It is the result of platforms competing for attention in a world where attention is fragile and easily lost. And so we scheme articles, we skim conversations. We skim explanations, opinions, arguments, research, even our own thoughts. But skimming, for all its convenience, carries a psychological trick. It creates the feeling of understanding without the reality of it. The brain recognizes patterns of words or images and interprets this recognition as comprehension. The mind says, "I've seen this idea before, therefore I understand it." But recognizing a shape is not the same as studying its contours. Glancing at a map is not the same as knowing the terrain. Skimming is exposure. Understanding is transformation. Understanding changes the way we think, the way we interpret the world, the way we act. Skimming, in contrast, leaves almost no trace. The information passes through the mind like a shadow, visible, momentary, but without weight. This is why so many people feel informed, yet overwhelmed, confident, yet confused. They are constantly exposed to knowledge, but seldom engage with it deeply enough for it to become part of their internal landscape. Another problem with skimming is that it discourages complexity. The mind, conditioned to move quickly, becomes impatient with depth. Long arguments feel exhausting. Dense explanations feel unnecessary. Ambiguity feels irritating. Skimming trains the brain to expect instant clarity, even though the most meaningful ideas in life resist such simplicity. When we skim, we encounter only the surface of knowledge. The headlines, the summaries, the conclusions. We rarely see the reasoning, the context, the nuances. And when context disappears, misinterpretation grows. The world begins to appear simpler than it truly is, not because simplicity exists, but because skimming cannot hold complexity long enough to understand it. Another consequence is the illusion of productivity. Skimming creates the sensation of processing large amounts of information quickly, which can feel satisfying, even impressive. But this sensation is deceptive. To the brain, speed feels like achievement. But thinking does not happen at high speed. It happens in pauses, in reflection, in the slow digestion of ideas. Skimming gives the impression of learning while quietly training the mind not to learn. Over time, the neural pathways responsible for deep reading, the ones that enable sustained concentration, critical analysis, and integration of ideas, begin to weaken from lack of use. The mind becomes restless when confronted with long-form content. It grows uncomfortable in silence. It seeks stimulation instead of comprehension. The ability to think deeply shrinks from disuse, not inability. And the tragedy is this: the more we skim, the more we believe we understand, and the less we seek real understanding. Skimming feeds certainty. Understanding feeds humility. But beneath all of this lies a hopeful truth. The skill of deep reading is never lost. It is only dormant. The brain is remarkably adaptable. When given time and intention, it will rediscover its capacity for sustained attention, for nuance, for complexity. Deep reading begins by slowing down, even slightly. It begins by sitting with an idea long enough for it to reveal what skimming cannot see. It begins by letting information breathe, by giving thought space to unfold. Because true understanding does not come from exposure. It comes from integration. It comes from the moment when a concept stops being something we read and becomes something we know, something that alters the way we perceive the world. Skimming gives us movement. Understanding gives us meaning. Skimming is easy. Understanding is transformative. And in a world drowning in information, meaning is not just valuable, it is essential. Why the internet makes us feel smarter than we are. One of the strangest contradictions of the digital age is that people now know more than ever, yet understand less than ever. Not because they lack intelligence, but because the internet creates a powerful psychological illusion, the illusion of expertise, a sense of confidence that arises not from mastery, but from exposure, not from depth, but from familiarity, not from learning, but from proximity to knowledge. The illusion begins with the sheer abundance of information. When answers are everywhere, it becomes easy to mistake access for understanding. The brain confuses "I can look this up" with "I know this." It mistakes "I've seen this before" for "I grasp this fully." This illusion is subtle, but pervasive. We read a headline and feel informed about a global event. We watch a 3-minute video and feel qualified to discuss economics, psychology, geopolitics, or nutrition. We skim a summary and feel ready to debate people who have studied a subject for years. The internet has democratized information, but it has also democratized confidence, and confidence, when unearned, becomes a barrier to true knowledge. The illusion of expertise is strengthened by the structure of online content. Much of what we consume is designed to simplify complexity, to compress nuance into digestible fragments. This makes information easier to remember but harder to understand. A simplified explanation feels complete, even when it omits the most essential parts. A catchy summary feels authoritative, even when it hides contradictions. A viral thread feels insightful, even when it lacks depth. And because these pieces feel clear, the mind assumes there is nothing more to learn. Clarity is mistaken for completeness. Another subtle force behind this illusion is cognitive ease. When information is presented in simple, familiar language, the brain relaxes. and relaxed thinking feels like correct thinking. We underestimate the difficulty of a subject simply because the explanation is easy to process. This leads to a dangerous psychological pattern. The less we know, the more confident we become. This phenomenon, known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, has existed long before the internet, but the digital age has amplified it dramatically. Before, ignorance revealed itself through silence. Now, ignorance travels through comment sections, forums, videos, even public discourse. Bold, articulate, certain. The internet does not just give people information, it gives them an audience, and an audience amplifies confidence, not competence. Another reason the illusion of expertise thrives online is that we encounter knowledge in isolated fragments. We learn facts without learning frameworks, pieces without seeing the whole, results without understanding the reasoning behind them. This fragmented learning creates a false sense of comprehension. If I know the conclusion, I must understand the subject. But true expertise is not knowing the answers. It is understanding the path that leads to them. Experts ask better questions, not louder opinions. They recognize complexity where others see simplicity. They hesitate where others rush. They doubt where others assert. But on the internet, hesitation is mistaken for weakness, and certainty, even uninformed certainty, is rewarded with likes, shares, and validation. The illusion of expertise is reinforced by algorithmic design. Platforms show us content similar to what we already believe. This repetition makes our views feel accurate, mainstream, correct. The more our opinions are mirrored back at us, the more expert we feel because contradiction, which sharpens thought, is filtered away. Online, we do not see reality. We see a curated reflection of our assumptions. Over time, this leads to intellectual isolation disguised as intellectual confidence. People become certain of things they've never deeply examined. They debate with passion, but without grounding. They confuse strong feelings with strong arguments. And yet, beneath all this illusion, the human mind remains capable of extraordinary understanding. When it is given the chance to engage deeply, the first antidote to false expertise is humility, not humiliation, but humble curiosity. The recognition that knowing a little is not the same as knowing enough, and that the world is always more complex than it first appears. Humility opens the door to wisdom. It softens certainty. It makes space for real learning. The second antidote is depth, returning to long-form reading. Sustained attention, full arguments, and the slow acquisition of understanding. Expertise is not a moment, it is a process. It is not the memorization of facts. It is the integration of ideas. It is the ability to navigate complexity, not summarize it. And the third antidote is discomfort, the willingness to sit with confusion, to accept not knowing, to resist the impulse for instant clarity. Confusion is not failure. It is the beginning of comprehension. The illusion of expertise fades the moment we stop chasing certainty and start embracing inquiry. Because true intelligence is not the confidence of knowing. It is the humility to keep learning. When information loses its meaning, one of the quietest yet most destructive effects of the digital age is the disappearance of context. This erosion of the background, depth, nuance, and structure that give information its meaning. The internet delivers facts without frameworks, opinions without origins, claims without evidence, and conclusions without the long chain of reasoning that once gave them weight. We are surrounded by fragments, small, bright, easily digestible pieces of knowledge, but rarely given the fuller picture that transforms those pieces into understanding. Context is the invisible architecture of knowledge. It is the why behind the what, the depth beneath the headline, the history behind the idea, the connections that allow us to see not just isolated facts, but living systems of meaning. Without context, information becomes hollow, a shell without substance, and the internet, by its very design, encourages this hollowing. Most digital platforms prioritize speed and brevity. A headline must be short enough to grab attention. A video must be immediate enough to prevent scrolling away. A post must deliver its point instantly. A meme must convey an entire worldview in a single image. In this environment, context becomes a liability. Something that takes too long. Something that risks losing the viewer's attention. Something that cannot compete with the rapid pace of digital consumption. So the world is presented in fragments. Sharp, loud, the brain, encountering these fragments thousands of times a day, begins to adapt. It learns to accept information without seeking the surrounding narrative. It becomes comfortable with conclusions without evidence. It stops noticing what is missing because everything it consumes is missing something. This collapse of context creates confusion, but a strangely confident confusion, because fragments often feel complete. A sentence feels like a story. A statistic feels like proof. A quote feels like wisdom. A post feels like education. A claim feels like truth. But without the story, the proof, the reasoning, or the full truth, these impressions mislead more than they inform. Take scientific research. For example, online, complex studies are reduced to simplified headlines. Scientists find, experts say. New research proves. The nuance, methodology, limitations, and interpretations vanish. What remains is a distorted shadow of the original work, digestible, but dangerously incomplete. Context disappears, and misunderstanding grows. The same happens with history, politics, psychology, philosophy, economics. Fields that require depth, but are presented as surface. Context collapse also affects communication between people. Online, we see statements without tone, opinions without personal history, emotions without the facial expressions that frame them. This lack of context fuels conflict, misinterpretation, outrage. The mind fills in missing context with assumptions, and assumptions are often wrong. Another consequence of losing context is the rise of false expertise. People form strong opinions based on fragments, unaware of the vast landscape of knowledge surrounding those fragments. This creates confidence without competence, a certainty built on incomplete information. When context disappears, humility disappears with it. Context also protects us from manipulation. When we understand where information comes from, who benefits from it, what its limitations are, and how it fits into a broader system, we become harder to deceive. But when information is stripped of context, we become vulnerable, susceptible to emotional narratives, viral misinformation, and oversimplified truths. The collapse of context is not just intellectual, it is emotional. Without context, we lose the ability to empathize. We see actions without understanding the pressures behind them. We see choices without knowing the histories that shape them. We see people without appreciating the complexities of their lives. Context is what makes us human to one another. So what does it mean to restore context in a world that constantly erases it? It begins with slowing down, giving information the space it needs to reveal its shape. It requires choosing long-form content over short fragments. It calls for asking questions. What is missing here? What is the full story? What came before this? What assumptions am I making? Restoring context also means cultivating systems of knowledge rather than isolated facts. It means understanding principles, not just conclusions, patterns, not just events, processes, not just snapshots. It means remembering that truth is rarely simple, and that anything presented as simple is likely incomplete. And perhaps, most importantly, restoring context requires intellectual humility. The humility to admit that every snippet of knowledge sits inside a larger world of meaning. The humility to recognize how much we do not see, how much we do not know, how much lies beneath the surface. Context is what transforms information into wisdom. Without it, we are surrounded by data yet deprived of understanding. The digital world may fragment knowledge, but the human mind, given time, care, and intention, can piece it together again. How complexity gets reduced to cute images and catchy phrases. There is a strange cultural phenomenon unfolding quietly beneath the surface of modern communication, something that at first seems harmless, even immoral, but has gradually become one of the most powerful forces shaping the way we think. It is a transformation of truth into memes. Short, simplified, emotionally charged fragments that travel faster than reason, flatter our instincts, and replace understanding with instant recognition. A meme is not just a picture, it is a compressed idea, condensed, stripped of nuance, sharpened into something that can be consumed in seconds. And in a world that worships speed and brevity, such compression becomes irresistible. Memes speak the language of the modern mind. Fast, visual, emotional, easy. But truth is none of these things. The problem begins with scale. Every day, millions of people encounter thousands of microfragments of information. Jokes, slogans, screenshots, quotes, out of context, statements, diagrams, summaries. The brain cannot process depth at this speed, so it adapts by forming impressions instead of conclusions. Memes become shortcuts to belief. A single sentence replaces an entire argument. A single image replaces a historical context. A single joke replaces a philosophical position. A single chart replaces a scientific methodology. The world becomes bite-sized. Truth is rarely truth at all. Memes flatten complexity. They create the illusion that every issue has only two sides, that every disagreement is a moral battle, that every problem has a simple villain and a simple solution. They strip ideas of their history, their nuance, their contradictions. They reward emotional reaction over thoughtful reflection. The memification of truth is not evil, it is efficient. And the mind, conditioned by digital speed, craves efficiency. But efficiency is not in sight. One of the most dangerous aspects of memes is how they hijack emotion. A clever phrase, a funny image, a dramatic statement. These bypass the analytical parts of the brain and go straight to the emotional centers. Once an idea becomes emotionally charged, it becomes harder to question, harder to analyze, harder to let go. Emotion becomes evidence. Virality becomes validation. Repetition becomes truth. Memes don't spread because they are correct. They spread because they are shareable. And so ideas that are simplistic, shallow, or distorted often travel farther and faster than ideas that are accurate, nuanced, or complex. Another danger lies in how memes create identity. People associate themselves with certain ideas, not because they have studied them, but because they have shared them. Posting becomes belonging. Liking becomes loyalty. Sharing becomes signaling. Memes let us express opinions we never formed. They let us join groups we never consciously chose. They let us feel informed without the burden of understanding. This creates a new kind of intellectual fragility, a mind filled with memorized slogans, but deprived of the depth behind them. Memes also distort our sense of what conversation is. Instead of discussing ideas, people exchange pre-packaged positions. Instead of thinking, they repeat. Instead of connecting, they polarize. Instead of listening, they counter-meme. Dialogue collapses into content, and content, unlike conversation, does not grow. It spreads. It amplifies. It fragments. It entertains. But it does not think. The memification of truth also affects education, politics, psychology, and culture. Students now summarize entire books into sentence-long aesthetic quotes. Political views are shaped by oversimplified graphics. Scientific ideas are reduced to jokes. Historical events are turned into dramatic one-liners. The tragedy is not that memes exist. Humor and simplicity have always been part of human communication, but that they are replacing the deeper forms of engagement that once balanced them. The mind becomes accustomed to the rhythm of quick insight, quick judgment, quick dopamine. Slow thinking begins to feel unnatural. Depth begins to feel unnecessary. Long explanations begin to feel outdated. Yet, beneath the meme culture, something remarkable still exists. The human mind's capacity for context, nuance, and depth. It may be overshadowed, but it is not lost. Escaping the memification of truth does not mean rejecting humor or simplicity. It means remembering that they are starting points, not destinations. It means pausing before absorbing an idea. It means asking, what is missing here? What is the full story? What is the source, the reasoning, the complexity behind this? It means choosing curiosity over instant agreement. It means valuing questions as much as answers. Because truth cannot be compressed into a single image, at least not without losing its soul. Truth is alive. It expands. It contradicts itself. It surprises us. It complicates things. It resists the clean lines and punchy clarity that memes demand, and a mind that seeks truth must learn to resist that demand as well. Memes may simplify the world, but thinking restores its depth. The psychology of believing without knowing. One of the strangest features of the human mind is its willingness to trust ideas it cannot explain. We see this everywhere. People confidently arguing about topics they cannot define, defending beliefs they cannot articulate, endorsing claims they have not examined, repeating phrases that sound intelligent but carry no personal understanding beneath them. This is not stupidity, it is psychology. The mind prefers certainty over accuracy, coherence over complexity, belonging over truth, and in the digital age, where information is abundant but understanding is scarce, these preferences shape our beliefs far more than logic does. To understand why we trust what we don't understand, we must begin with something ancient: cognitive ease. When information feels easy to process, when it is familiar, simple, emotionally resonant, the brain interprets this ease as correctness. It thinks, this feels true, therefore it probably is. We confuse the comfort of recognition with the validity of reality. The internet amplifies this tendency by flooding us with repeated ideas. Repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates trust. A concept we see many times begins to feel obvious, even if we've never examined it. This is why misinformation spreads quickly. The more we see it, the more credible it becomes. Exposure becomes confidence. Confidence becomes belief. And belief becomes identity. Another reason we trust what we don't understand is social proof. The tendency to assume something is correct if many others believe it. In online environments, where views are quantified by likes, shares, and comments, this effect becomes overwhelming. A video with 1 million views feels more true than a quiet lecture. A viral claim feels more credible than a careful argument. An emotionally charged post feels more accurate than a peer-reviewed study. We do not trust the content, we trust the crowd. And the crowd is often reacting emotionally, not thinking critically. The mind also relies on authority bias, the assumption that information coming from someone confident, articulate, or charismatic must be valid. Online, authority is easy to fake: a polished voice, a bold tone, a clever graphic. These create the appearance of expertise, even when actual expertise is absent. We trust confidence more than competence. The tragedy is that experts often sound uncertain because real knowledge is full of complexity, nuance, and the admission of what is not yet known. But uncertainty feels uncomfortable, and discomfort pushes us toward voices that offer simplicity. We trust simplicity because complexity feels like ignorance. We trust fluency because confusion feels like failure. We trust emotion because logic feels slow. Another force driving trust without understanding is identity protection. Beliefs are not just ideas. They are social signals. They communicate who we are, where we belong, what tribe we're part of. People often adopt views that align with their group, not because they understand them, but because disagreement threatens social belonging. In this way, belief becomes a badge rather than a conclusion. We trust ideas because they reinforce who we think we are, not because we grasp their truth. The mind also uses cognitive shortcuts to navigate the overwhelming complexity of modern information. We rely on heuristics, simple rules that help us make quick judgments. These shortcuts are useful when stakes are low, but when applied to difficult topics, science, politics, health, philosophy, they create illusions of knowledge. We trust the first explanation we hear, because investigating alternatives requires effort. We trust emotionally charged stories, because they feel meaningful. We trust simplified narratives, because nuance requires patience. We trust what is available, not what is accurate. Another psychological force at play is narrative coherence, the tendency to believe explanations that form a satisfying story. The mind loves stories because they organize chaos into meaning. A narrative that feels right is often more persuasive than a mountain of factual detail. This is why conspiracy theories thrive. They offer compelling stories to fill in gaps that reality leaves open. Finally, we trust what we don't understand because understanding requires vulnerability. To admit we don't know is to expose a gap in our identity. It forces humility. It demands curiosity. It requires setting aside ego, something the modern environment rarely encourages. Most people would rather cling to a false certainty than face the discomfort of honest ignorance. But here lies the hopeful truth. The moment we recognize this tendency, thinking begins to reawaken. Awareness breaks psychological spells. When we see how easily we trust without understanding, we start to question. When we notice our instinct to believe familiar ideas, we slow down. When we recognize that confidence is not competence, we look deeper. The mind becomes more careful, more curious, more open. Because trust without understanding may feel easy, but understanding without trust is far more powerful. And the journey from false certainty to genuine insight begins with a simple, courageous question. Do I actually know this? Or do I just feel like I do? The rise of the uninformed expert. One of the most paradoxical features of the digital age is a soaring confidence with which people express their opinions, even as their actual understanding of the world becomes shallower and more fragile. Today, confidence is everywhere. In comment sections, in debates, in social media posts, in casual conversations, people speak boldly about topics they barely grasp, defend positions they never examined, and argue as though certainty were a form of intelligence. This phenomenon is not merely cultural, it is psychological. The modern information environment rewards confidence, not accuracy, not nuance, not humility. And because confident voices rise to the top, confidence becomes contagious. The first force behind digital overconfidence is the illusion of proximity to knowledge. With the internet, information feels close. At any moment we can search for a fact, a definition, a statistic, an explanation. The ease of access creates a false sense of possession. The mind quietly blurs the line between I can find out and I already know. We confuse the availability of information with its integration. In earlier eras, knowledge required work, reading, studying, reflecting, questioning. The effort itself taught humility. But when effort disappears, humility follows. The internet gives us the feeling of knowing things we have never truly learned. Another key driver of overconfidence is the fragmentation of information. We encounter ideas in tiny pieces, quotes, headlines, summaries, snippets. Each piece feels digestible, manageable, understandable. Our mind interprets this ease as mastery, even though the deeper structure of the topic remains unseen. A person who reads one paragraph about a scientific study feels competent to debate actual scientists. Someone who watches a short video on finance feels prepared to lecture others. A person exposed to a simplified explanation of psychology feels ready to diagnose strangers online. The fragments feel complete, but the completeness is an illusion. The third cause of digital overconfidence comes from the flattening of expertise. Online, all voices appear equal. A researcher who spent 20 years studying climate science appears alongside a commenter who spent 20 minutes reading half an article. The visual similarity creates a psychological distortion. If both voices occupy the same space, they must hold similar weight. The platform erases the hierarchy of knowledge, and the mind follows. Then comes algorithmic reinforcement. Social media feeds us content aligned with our interests, beliefs, and emotional tendencies. We experience a constant stream of agreement, which strengthens our confidence while narrowing our worldview. When all you see are ideas that confirm your beliefs, you begin to assume that your beliefs are the norm, that everyone agrees, that your perspective is obvious, that dissent is ignorance. Repetition becomes validation. Validation becomes certainty. Certainty becomes overconfidence. Another cause of rising certainty is the emotional design of digital communication. Online interactions reward boldness, brevity, and clarity. Ambiguity does not go viral. Nuance does not attract attention. Humility does not spark engagement. But confident statements, no matter how simplistic, spread rapidly. The social reward system reinforces confidence, even when it is unearned. We learn to speak in absolutes because absolutes get noticed. We internalize the idea that loudness equals correctness. Overconfidence also emerges from identity-based thinking. Today, beliefs are not merely opinions. They are symbols of belonging. Agreeing with one's group earns validation. Disagreeing invites criticism. And so people cling to their beliefs with emotional intensity, mistaking loyalty for understanding. Confidence becomes a shield protecting the identity, not a reflection of knowledge. Another subtle driver is the disappearance of intellectual struggle. When information is easy, Thinking feels unnecessary. When something feels easy, the mind assumes it must understand it. But difficulty is not a sign of weakness. It is the birthplace of insight. Without difficulty, confidence floats freely, disconnected from reality. Yet perhaps the most profound force behind digital overconfidence is the loss of quiet. In silence, doubt is space to speak. In reflection, humility emerges naturally. In solitude, the mind sees its own limits. But when the mind is constantly stimulated, scrolling, reacting, consuming, there is no room for doubt to form. Confidence remains unchallenged because the mind never slows down enough to question itself. But despite all these pressures, overconfidence is not inevitable. It is simply a habit of assuming rather than investigating, a habit of reacting rather than reflecting, a habit of speaking rather than thinking. And habits, no matter how deeply ingrained, can be changed. The antidote to digital overconfidence is not silence. It is awareness. Awareness of how little we truly know. Awareness of how easily we are seduced by familiarity and emotional clarity. Awareness of how much richer, deeper, more complex the world becomes when we stop pretending to understand everything. True intelligence is not loud. It does not shout. It does not rush. It does not demand to be right. True intelligence begins with humility. The quiet realization that knowing more starts with admitting how much we don't. There is a quiet kind of wisdom that once shaped how people learned, discussed, and understood the world. A wisdom rooted not in certainty, but in humility. It was the simple, steady awareness that one person cannot know everything. That understanding is a lifelong process, and that every belief we hold is shaped by limitations we often cannot see. But in the digital age, intellectual humility has become almost invisible. People speak as though correctness is a requirement, as though uncertainty is a flaw, as though admitting I might be wrong is a sign of weakness rather than strength. This shift is subtle, but its consequences are profound. Without humility, thinking becomes rigid. Without humility, learning stops. Without humility, conversation collapses into confrontation. To understand why humility has faded, we must first understand its nature. Intellectual humility is not self-doubt. It is not low confidence. It is not indecision. Humility is the recognition that truth is larger than our perspective, that knowledge is endless, and our grasp of it will always be partial. Humility opens the door to inquiry. Arrogance closes it. The first reason humility has declined is the illusion of knowledge created by the internet. When information appears limitless and easy, the mind begins to feel limitless and easy as well. The effort required to learn deeply becomes invisible, replaced by the illusion that quick exposure equals understanding. This illusion inflates confidence and quietly suppresses humility. Why confess uncertainty when information is right there, when you can search anything, when everything feels accessible? But accessibility is not mastery, and the illusion of mastery is the enemy of humility. Another force behind the decline of intellectual humility is emotional reasoning. The tendency to evaluate ideas based on how they make us feel, rather than whether they are true. When a belief becomes tied to identity, challenging it feels like attacking the self. And when the self feels threatened, humility disappears. People cling to beliefs because beliefs become emotional armor. To say I might be wrong would mean lowering the shield. The digital world intensifies this through tribal identities. Online communities form around shared opinions, shared narratives, shared enemies. Belonging becomes tied to agreement. Disagreement feels like betrayal. Humility becomes socially risky. Admitting uncertainty can push you outside your group's boundaries. So people choose loyalty over honesty, agreement over reflection, certainty over truth. Another reason humility has faded is algorithmic validation. Digital platforms reward confidence, bold statements, absolute claims, and emotional certainty. Humility, with its pauses, caveats, and thoughtful hesitations, struggles to compete. A nuanced idea may be correct, but a dramatic simplification will travel farther. And because the loudest voices receive the most attention, humility begins to seem outdated, weak, out of place. The architecture of the internet is biased against humility. Humility also declines because silence has disappeared. Before the digital age, people had space to think before they spoke, to reflect, reconsider, reframe their views. But today, everything is immediate. Responses are instantaneous. Opinions are constant. Reflection is rare. In this rush, humility, which requires time, gets crowded out. Another dimension of this decline lies in our changing relationship with error. In many online spaces, mistakes are punished harshly. A wrong phrase, a misinterpreted comment, an outdated viewpoint. Any error can be met with ridicule, outrage, or moral judgment. This creates a culture in which admitting mistakes becomes dangerous. People fear being wrong, so they avoid the appearance of uncertainty altogether. Yet the paradox is that without confronting our errors, we cannot grow. Humility is not just intellectual, it is emotional courage. The courage to let go of mistaken ideas, to update beliefs, to learn in public, to evolve. But emotional courage is rare in environments that punish imperfection. Despite these pressures, humility remains the key to genuine intelligence. Confident ignorance is brittle. Humble curiosity is unbreakable. Humility allows us to listen. It allows us to ask questions. It allows us to change. It allows us to learn from those we disagree with. It allows us to prioritize truth over pride. Without humility, conversation turns into competition. With humility, conversation becomes collaboration. Without humility, debates divide. With humility, debates illuminate. Without humility, knowledge becomes a weapon. With humility, knowledge becomes a shared journey. In many ways, humility is the secret backbone of wisdom. Not glamorous, not loud, not viral, but steady, grounding, honest. And the most hopeful part of all is this: humility can return the moment we choose it. It begins with a single, quiet shift. I might be wrong. Not as a confession of weakness, but as an acknowledgement of reality. Not as a surrender, but as an opening. Not as a retreat, but as a step forward. Humility does not diminish intelligence, it elevates Italiano, because only a mind willing to bend can truly grow. How constant stimulation silences the thinking mind. If there is one defining feature of the digital age, one constant presence that shapes our days, our thoughts, our emotions, even the rhythms of our inner life, it is noise, not the physical sound of traffic or crowded rooms, but the invisible noise of constant stimulation. Notifications, updates, messages, headlines, rumors, opinions, alerts, recommendations, reminders, arguments, ads. We live inside an unending stream of mental noise, a river of stimuli that never stops flowing, never pauses, never leaves the mind alone long enough to catch its breath. And because this noise is digital, weightless, and silent, we underestimate its power. But nothing damages thinking more effectively than the absence of quiet. For most of human history, silence was abundant. People walked without headphones, read without interruptions, cooked without checking their phones, rested without scrolling. Thoughts had space to unfold naturally. The mind had room to wander, reflect, imagine, question. But today, silence has become a scarce resource, not because we don't have time for it, but because we have forgotten how to tolerate it. Noise has become comfort. Noise has become companionship. Noise has become the default environment of the mind. And this constant stimulation comes with a price: the slow erosion of our ability to think deeply, clearly, independently. The first way noise damages the mind is through attention fragmentation. Every notification, every buzz, every banner, every suggestion pulls the mind in a slightly new direction. One distraction feels harmless, but thousands of tiny interruptions accumulate into a fractured attention span. The mind becomes restless, unable to stay with a single idea long enough for it to develop into insight. Depth requires continuity, but noise breaks continuity into pieces. Another consequence of noise is emotional exhaustion. Much of digital noise is charged outrage, excitement, fear, urgency, drama. Even when we think we're just scrolling, the nervous system is absorbing emotional signals at high speed. This drains mental energy, leaving the brain too tired to think critically. A tired mind seeks comfort in simplicity, familiarity, and emotion, the very things that undermine rational thought. Noise also fuels mental clutter, the constant filling of the mind with irrelevant information. We learn facts, that serve no purpose, absorb arguments that do not change us, gather opinions we never asked for, witness conflicts that have nothing to do with our lives. The mind becomes crowded not with knowledge, but with stimuli. In a cluttered mind, clarity becomes a miracle. Deep thinking requires space, a spaciousness that noise steals from us little by little. Another effect of noise is the destruction of boredom. Boredom, once a natural part of life, has become something people flee from instantly. But boredom has a purpose. It is the quiet doorway through which creativity enters. It is the pause that allows the mind to reorganize itself. It is the silence in which insights form. Noise closes this doorway. It fills every spare moment with stimulation, and by doing so, removes the environment in which introspection grows. Noise also encourages reactivity instead of reflection. When stimuli arrive constantly, the mind shifts into a reactive mode. Quick responses, quick judgments, quick emotions. But thinking is not reactive. Thinking is reflective. Reflection requires time. Noise consumes that time before reflection can begin. In this way, noise creates a society filled with opinions, but deprived of thought. Another subtle danger of noise is the erosion of internal voice. The mind, constantly exposed to external voices, influencers, commentators, strangers, algorithms, begins to lose touch with its own inner guidance. We start thinking in borrowed language, feeling borrowed emotions, forming borrowed beliefs. The internal voice becomes quieter until it is almost impossible to hear beneath the constant hum of the world. But perhaps the most profound effect of noise is the illusion of mental activity. Noise makes us feel engaged, busy, stimulated. It creates the sensation of thinking without the substance of it. We mistake movement for progress. We mistake stimulation for awareness. We mistake mental agitation for mental clarity. Silence, on the other hand, reveals the truth. Without noise, many of us struggle to sit with our thoughts, our doubts, our questions, our unresolved emotions. And yet, silence is exactly what allows the mind to heal, to organize, to understand. If noise is the flood, quiet is the shore. Finding quiet does not mean escaping technology, or rejecting information, or isolating oneself. It simply means reclaiming space for the mind to breathe a few minutes without stimulation. A walk without a phone, a conversation without scrolling, a moment of stillness at the beginning or end of the day. Quiet is not the absence of life. It is the presence of awareness. In the end, the noise problem is not about volume. It is about space. Noise fills every corner of the mind, leaving no room for thought to grow. But the moment we begin clearing even a small part of that space, something remarkable happens. Thoughts become clearer, emotions settle, insight appears, intuition awakens. The mind remembers what it is capable of when it is not drowning in constant stimulation. Silence is not empty. Silence is where the mind returns to itself. How algorithms shape what we think is real. In the past, people formed their understanding of the world slowly through books, conversations, personal experience, teachers, and lived events. Knowledge was a landscape we explored deliberately, guided by curiosity and shaped by the diversity of what we encountered. But today, much of what we know is determined by something we never see. Algorithms. Invisible, automatic systems quietly decide what information reaches us, what perspectives we hear, what ideas appear in our feeds. We think we are choosing what to read or watch, but in reality, we are choosing from a menu curated specifically for us. A menu designed not for truth, but for engagement. Thus begins the age of algorithmic knowledge bubbles. These bubbles are not built by intent, ideology, or conscious design. They emerge naturally from the logic of digital platforms. Show people what keeps their attention, and avoid showing them what might push them away. Over time, this feedback loop becomes an intellectual echo chamber. The first danger of algorithmic bubbles is the narrowing of perspective. The internet seems infinite, but our feeds are not. They are personalized mirrors, reflecting back what we already believe, enjoy, fear, or desire. We see news that aligns with our worldview, jokes that match our humor, explanations that confirm our assumptions. The more we click, the narrower the mirror becomes. This narrowing creates the illusion that our view of the world is the majority view. We start to think everyone knows this. Everyone agrees with this. This is obvious. The mind mistakes algorithmic repetition for universal truth. Another danger is the illusion of completeness. When information is curated to match our preferences, we rarely see what we disagree with. Not because it's rare, but because it's filtered out. Disagreement becomes invisible. Alternative explanations disappear. Contradictory evidence never reaches us. We begin to feel informed, even though we are missing half the story. This creates a psychological trap. The more incomplete our knowledge becomes, the more complete it feels. Algorithms reward emotion more than accuracy, polarization more than nuance, outrage more than understanding. Content that sparks strong reactions rises to the top. Content that encourages slow thought sinks. Thus, our knowledge of the world becomes shaped not by truth, but by stimulation. Another subtle effect of algorithmic bubbles is the reinforcement of identity. When we repeatedly encounter ideas that reflect our beliefs, they begin to define us. We start to see our opinions not as interpretations, but as extensions of who we are. And once beliefs become identity, challenging them feels like a personal attack. The bubble becomes a psychological shield, comforting but fragile. Algorithmic personalization also affects how we assess expertise. Voices that are popular within our bubble appear authoritative, while voices outside it seem irrelevant or misguided. We mistake visibility for credibility. This distorts our sense of what knowledge is, where it comes from, and how it should be evaluated. Another danger lies in the loss of intellectual flexibility. When we inhabit a bubble long enough, our brain becomes accustomed to predictability. We expect information to confirm our worldview. We grow impatient with nuance, skeptical of alternatives, dismissive of complexity. Disagreement begins to feel threatening instead of enlightening. Without exposure to diverse perspectives, the mind becomes rigid, unable to adapt, rethink, or grow. But perhaps the most profound effect of algorithmic bubbles is how they reshape our sense of reality itself. If knowledge is filtered, our reality becomes filtered. If we only see certain kinds of stories, the world appears that way. If we see conflict everywhere, we assume society is collapsing. If we see success everywhere, we assume everyone else is thriving. If we see misinformation repeatedly, we begin to trust it. Algorithms do not just show us content, they shape the emotional and intellectual landscape in which our beliefs are formed. And yet, despite their power, these bubbles are not inescapable. The first step toward breaking them is awareness. The recognition that what we see is not the whole world, only a curated slice of it. The algorithms do not care about truth or understanding. They care about engagement. Knowing this allows us to step back, question, and seek information intentionally rather than passively. The second step is intentional diversity. Reading from multiple sources, engaging with ideas we disagree with, exposing ourselves to unfamiliar perspectives, not to convert ourselves, but to expand the boundaries of what we can understand. The third step is slowing down, resisting the lure of emotionally charged content, giving ourselves time to reflect before reacting, allowing the mind to process information instead of drowning in it. Because the mind grows not from repetition, but from contrast, not from familiarity, but from challenge, not from comfort, but from curiosity. Algorithmic bubbles shrink the world around us, but curiosity expands it again. And a mind that deliberately seeks truth, even outside its comfort zone, becomes stronger than any system designed to shape it. Why emotion wins in the digital age? For most of human history, the emotional brain, ancient, instinctive, fast, guided our survival. It warned us of danger, rewarded us for connection, pushed us toward action when hesitation could mean death. The thinking brain, slower and more deliberate, evolved later. Its role was to analyze, plan, evaluate, interpret, to reflect rather than react. These two systems once worked together in a delicate balance. Emotion provided energy. Reason provided direction. But the digital age has disrupted this balance in a profound way. Today, almost everything we encounter online is designed to provoke emotion first and thought second, or not at all. The emotional brain thrives on speed. The digital world accelerates everything. The emotional brain thrives on novelty. The digital world provides infinite novelty. The emotional brain thrives on intensity. The digital world exaggerates every signal. When the emotional brain is constantly activated, the thinking brain simply cannot keep up. The first effect of this imbalance is emotional hijacking. Content that triggers anger, excitement, fear, envy, outrage, or desire captures our attention instantly. Algorithms learn this and feed us more. The mind becomes conditioned to seek the emotional spike rather than the careful truth. We scroll not because we want to think, but because we want to feel. This constant stimulation strengthens the emotional circuits, while weakening the reflective ones. Over time, the thinking brain becomes a visitor in its own house, present, but rarely in control. Another effect is the collapse of deliberation. Logical thinking requires pause, a space in which the mind can weigh ideas, question assumptions, evaluate evidence, but the digital environment leaves no room for pause. The next stimulus arrives before the thought has finished forming. The emotional brain reacts instantly. The thinking brain doesn't get the chance. This is why people often regret what they say online, why arguments escalate rapidly, why misinformation spreads so quickly. Emotion moves faster than reason. Another reason emotion dominates is cognitive overload. When the mind receives too much information, the thinking brain becomes exhausted. It cannot analyze everything. So the emotional brain steps in, offering quick answers, automatic interpretations, snap judgments. Emotion is a shortcut. Reason is a journey. The more overwhelmed we feel, the more we rely on the shortcut. Another subtle force at play is identity-based thinking. Emotions are deeply tied to who we believe ourselves to be. When a belief aligns with our identity, the emotional brain protects it fiercely. Challenges feel like threats. Alternative viewpoints feel like attacks. The thinking brain tries to evaluate the argument. The emotional brain tries to defend the self. In identity-based conflicts, the emotional brain almost always wins. Digital platforms amplify these by encouraging us to curate identities: political, aesthetic, lifestyle, intellectual. Once identity is tied to belief, humility becomes nearly impossible. Another factor is the reward cycle of emotional engagement. Every like, comment, share, notification triggers a small release of dopamine, the neurotransmitter of reward and anticipation. This creates a feedback loop in which emotional reactions feel satisfying, even addictive. Over time, the mind begins to seek emotional stimulation as a form of validation. Calm reflection feels boring. Rational argument feels slow. Nuanced perspectives feel emotionally flat. This emotional reward cycle subtly trains the mind away from thinking and toward instinct. Another reason emotion dominates is the human tendency to fill in gaps. The emotional brain completes stories quickly, even with limited evidence. A headline is enough. A single image is enough. A quote taken out of context is enough. Logic would ask for more information, but emotion insists it already knows. This leads to impulsive decisions, rapid judgments, and the rise of simplistic explanations for complex problems. Emotion creates certainty. Reason creates doubt, and certainty is easier to live with. But perhaps the most profound reason emotion dominates is the loss of internal quiet. Reason grows in silence, in the spaces between stimuli, and the moments when the mind is free to contemplate, compare, question. But when noise fills every corner of our inner world, there is no room for thought to form. Emotion reacts. Thought requires room. The tragedy is that both systems, emotional and rational, are essential. Emotion makes us human. Reason makes us wise. The goal is not to silence emotion, but to restore balance, to give the thinking brain the time and space it needs to function. When the emotional brain dominates, we survive. When the thinking brain participates, we evolve. Rebuilding this balance begins with awareness, noticing our emotional triggers, recognizing when we are reacting instead of thinking. It continues with slowing down, allowing the mind a moment before responding, a breath before reacting, a pause before interpreting, and it deepens with intentional practices that cultivate reflection. Reading long texts, engaging in real dialogue, creating space for quiet, seeking nuance over drama. Emotion is not the enemy of thought, but when emotion leads and thought follows blindly, understanding collapses into instinct. And yet, the moment we begin to reclaim the space between stimulus and response, something shifts. The motion becomes information, not instruction. Thought becomes possible again. Wisdom returns, because the emotional brain may be louder, but the thinking brain, when given room, is infinitely deeper. How to think deeply in a shallow world. When people describe the modern world, they often speak about speed. The rapid pace of information, the constant rush of updates, the acceleration of everything. But the deeper problem is not speed itself. It is the fact that our inner lives have been shaped to match it. We think faster, but less clearly. We know more, but understand less. We react immediately, but reflect rarely. And yet the capacity for deep understanding, the quiet, deliberate, expansive way of thinking that gives meaning to knowledge, has not disappeared. It has only become dormant, buried beneath noise, stimulation, and the illusion of certainty. Rebuilding this capacity is not a lost cause. It is a return to something the mind has always known how to do. To rebuild true understanding, the first step is slowing down. Not in the sense of withdrawing from the world, but in the sense of reclaiming cognitive space. Understanding requires time to absorb, time to question, time to let ideas settle. Even a few minutes of undistracted attention can transform the quality of thought. In a world that rewards speed, slowness becomes a form of strength. The second step is learning to tolerate confusion. Modern culture treats confusion as failure, something to avoid or escape as quickly as possible. But confusion is the doorway to insight. It is the moment in which the mind encounters something it does not yet grasp, something that stretches its limits. Complex ideas often begin in fog, not clarity. Staying with that fog, instead of fleeing it, allows the mind to slowly construct understanding. To rebuild deep thinking, we must reframe confusion as a sign that growth is happening beneath the surface. The third step is seeking full arguments instead of fragments. Most digital content gives us conclusions without the reasoning that leads to them. But understanding lies in the reasoning, not the result. Reading long-form texts, listening to extended discussions, exploring books instead of summaries. These practices reintroduce the mind to the structure of real knowledge. Deep understanding is architectural. It requires foundations, not just rooftops. Another step is engaging with ideas we disagree with. Algorithms and social bubbles show us only what matches our worldview, which creates the illusion that our beliefs are complete. But truth expands at the edges of our comfort zone. Exposure to different perspectives challenges the mind, strengthens reasoning, and encourages intellectual humility. A belief that has never been questioned is not a belief. It is a habit. We rebuild understanding by seeking challenge, not avoiding it. Another essential step is cultivating attention. Attention is the oxygen of thought. Without it, ideas suffocate before they can grow. Practices like deep reading, journaling, or spending time in nature strengthen the mind's ability to focus, not through force, but through space. A focused mind sees more. A distracted mind only sees movement. Also important is learning to ask better questions. The internet gives us answers instantly, which discourages us from forming meaningful questions. But understanding begins with curiosity, with a recognition that there is something we do not know, and the desire to explore it. Questions are the compass of thought. Without them, we drift. Rebuilding understanding also requires embracing nuance. Life is rarely black and white. The world resists simple narratives. Nuance is where truth hides, in the gray spaces between extremes. Training ourselves to see nuance allows us to think with maturity rather than immediacy. Nuance is not indecision. It is depth. Another pillar of true understanding is intellectual humility. The awareness that we are always learning, always incomplete, always evolving. Humility does not diminish intelligence. It protects Italiano. It keeps the mind open enough to grow. A humble thinker is not someone who denies their knowledge, but someone who understands its limits. Finally, Rebuilding understanding requires moments of quiet. Silence is the cradle of insight. In silence, scattered thoughts settle, connections form, questions rise, and inner clarity expands. Even brief pauses throughout the day restore the mind's ability to think deeply. Quiet is not an escape from the world, it is a return to ourselves. In each of these steps, there is no perfection required, only intention. Deep thinking is not a talent, it is a practice, not a gift, but a habit. Not something achieved once, but something cultivated continually. And as we rebuild this capacity, something remarkable begins to happen. The world, once overwhelming, becomes interpretable. Information, once chaotic, becomes meaningful. Ideas, once scattered, begin to interconnect. The mind shifts from consuming knowledge to understanding it. In a world saturated with noise and surface-level certainty, choosing to understand deeply is an act of quiet rebellion, a way to reclaim our inner life from the velocity of the external one. Understanding is not extinct. It is waiting beneath the noise, beneath the speed, beneath the distractions, ready to return the moment we create space for it. Rethinking what it means to know. As we arrive at the final part of this journey, a quiet question begins to surface. A question that sits beneath everything we have explored so far. What does it mean to know something in the 21st century? The answer is no longer simple. The internet has expanded the boundaries of information while contracting the boundaries of understanding. It has made knowledge accessible, yet fragile, abundant, yet shallow, constant, yet unstable. To rebuild our intellectual lives, we must rethink the meaning of knowledge itself. For centuries, knowledge was tied to memory, facts held in the mind, ideas integrated into a worldview, skills practiced until they became second nature. To know something was to carry it within you. Knowledge lived in people, not devices. But today, much of what we call knowledge exists outside the mind, stored in search engines, servers, clouds, digital archives. We live with the comforting illusion that we know things simply because we can find them quickly. The first step toward a new definition of knowledge is recognizing that access is not understanding. The presence of information in our environment does not mean it is present in our minds. To know something today must mean more than being able to look it up. Knowledge must return to being something internal, something we can explain, connect, and use. A second part of this new definition is the idea that knowledge requires context. A fact without context is not knowledge. It is a fragment. A statistic without interpretation is noise. An opinion without history is a shadow. Understanding grows from seeing how pieces fit together, how ideas influence each other, how causes lead to effects, how complexity forms the world we live in. To know something is to understand its place within a larger landscape. Another shift in the definition of knowledge involves embodied comprehension, the ability to apply what we know, not just repeat it. In the digital age, it is easy to memorize conclusions without grasping the reasoning behind them. We can recite arguments we never thought through, defend positions we never examined, adopt terminology we never understood. But memorization is not mastery. Knowledge must become the ability to use an idea, not merely to recall it. Another dimension of this new definition is intellectual humility. To know something is also to understand the limits of that knowledge, to recognize uncertainty, to allow for contradiction, to remain open to revision. This humility is not weakness. It is what makes knowledge resilient rather than brittle. In the digital world, where certainty spreads faster than truth, humility becomes a form of wisdom. Knowledge without humility becomes dogma. Knowledge with humility becomes insight. A further aspect of knowledge in the modern age is the ability to filter, to discern the meaningful from the meaningless. We do not suffer from a shortage of information, but from an excess of it. Thus, the skill of knowing includes the ability to reject, ignore, and prioritize, to create mental clarity in a world of informational clutter. To know something today is also to know what not to absorb. Another layer of this new definition is critical thinking. The ability to analyze, not just consume, to question, not just accept, to examine the structure beneath an idea and understand how it holds together. Critical thinking turns information into insight, and insight into wisdom. Without it, knowledge becomes a decoration, something we display, not something we use. Perhaps most surprisingly, knowledge in the modern world must also include inner awareness, the ability to notice our emotional reactions, our biases, our blind spots, to see how our identity shapes our interpretation, how our desires bend our reasoning, how our fears distort our perception. Self-knowledge is the foundation of all other knowledge. Finally, knowledge today must be understood as a living relationship, not a static possession. It grows, shifts, expands, and evolves. It changes as we change. It deepens as we deepen. To know something is to be in conversation with it over time, not to freeze it in certainty, but to remain open to new layers of meaning. So what does it truly mean to know in an age when information is infinite and understanding is scarce? It means this: to know something is to understand it well enough to explain it clearly and question it honestly, to place it within a broader context, to apply it with skill, to revise it with humility, to filter it with discernment, to examine it with critical thought, to integrate it with self-awareness, and to return to it again and again, allowing it to deepen. Knowledge is no longer a static archive inside the mind. It is a dynamic, evolving capacity, a way of thinking, perceiving, and engaging with the world. And perhaps the greatest irony of all is this: in an era overflowing with information, true knowledge has become rare. Not because people are less intelligent, but because information has become detached from understanding. But the mind has not lost its ability to know. It has only lost its habits of knowing, and habits can be rebuilt patiently, intentionally, quietly. Knowledge is not dying. It is waiting for the moment when we choose depth over speed, reflection over reaction, truth over comfort, understanding over illusion. Waiting for the moment when we remember that to know is not to have information, but to have insight.